Thanks very much. And I actually didn't pay Nora for that lovely warm-up at all. It was totally spontaneous. Yes, I do remember that rather hairy flight across Sudan. But it was very interesting at that. It was a time, in fact, when Sudan was going through an unfortunately brief period of democracy, and Nora Owen was chair of the Oireachtas Development Committee, and we were visiting the Parliament there in Khartoum, which was a very interesting experience. But as I said, it was an interesting background to have. One other introduction, I'd say, we're quite googly down in Portarlington, where data protection is based, because without embarrassing him, the one member in the audience, the third member in the audience without a tie is actually from my office. And so I have put on this specially for you here, so in deference to the IIEA. So, Peter, I think it was fascinating to hear from Peter. We're very fortunate to have regular interaction with Peter in our office, partly linked to the fact that Google's headquarters are based here in Ireland. I think that I'm going to say very little, because I think his contribution is of far greater interest to you. But I'm trying to give a broader perspective on privacy in the internet age, I suppose partly based on our experience. I think, as Peter has already said, basically we're all living in a technology age, and those of us of a certain age probably still have to grapple with some of it. But basically, few of us can hardly remember a time when we didn't actually have the internet to be able to rely on. I mean, what would we do without search engines to do the research we have to do? Quite apart from what Peter refers to as vanity searches, in other words, checking up as to what the rest of the world is saying about you on the internet. Then, of course, those of us who are blessed, if that's the word, with teenagers will be fully aware of social networking sites and the amount of time they seem to spend on them. And again, they're also into the world of instant messaging, where again, you wonder, will you ever get access to the home computer because of what's going on? And sometimes you don't really want to know too much, maybe, what is going on. And then there is a future ahead of us, some of which I think Peter has hinted at, and I think it's called the Internet of Things, where basically are the technology of things. And the simplest example I get quoted is that your fridge will talk to you to tell you you're running out of milk, which I think you can regard as either a positive or a terrible curse. And again, it depends, I think, partly on your perspective on these things. But I think Peter's already quoted this famous or infamous statement. It's from Scott McNeely, who was the former CEO of Sun Microsystems. I think it caused certain difficulties to the privacy officer in Sun at the time, particularly as Sun was part of a network within the US at the time on privacy. And here's the CEO saying, oh, this is all nonsense, consumer privacy. I'm glad to say that Peter Fleischer is a good example of not quite signing up to that particular perspective. But it is actually quite a challenging statement, because to some degree, when you're involved in the internet age, involved with technology, you voluntarily must surrender an amount of your privacy in order to actually participate in it. And given that our model of privacy protection, including in Ireland and Europe generally, is based on giving the individual control over their privacy, there's an interesting question there, which I think Peter has posed, as to whether or not we need to change our laws to take account of the technology. I'm not necessarily reaching the same conclusion as he has, but it is a legitimate question. I think also part of having technology is that there can be a sense that someone's always watching you. In other words, is there any part of your life now where, in fact, there isn't some bit of technology that is potentially watching you? If you're on the internet, obviously, most of us realize you're on the Wild West, essentially, and whatever you put up there, anybody can access. But there are other aspects. When you walk out the door here, you're almost definitely being picked up by a CCTV camera. The Institute, for its own reasons, may have its own camera, but then the public cameras you will find run by the Gardaí are also looking at us. We're also more and more facing new technologies, and Peter gave some examples from Google, and many of these have privacy implications for all of us. I think Peter mentioned that there is a question mark over the current legal setup, that certainly we're now facing a world where data is flowing globally. Nevertheless, we have laws which are national, or in the EU's case, European-based, and there certainly is a case for more global rules. But one minor corrective on that I came across recently. Recently, the EU carried out a survey, a Eurobarometer survey on privacy, and I was quite interested in that one of the results is that less than 10% of European companies actually transfer data personal data outside of the European Union. I was very struck by that because I assumed it was a much higher percentage, but that's what these companies are saying, that less than 10% of them are transferring data outside of the European Union. So when we talk about, you know, the European directive and so on, if that statement is correct, and if that result is correct, you know, it suggests that perhaps we need to be careful about being too focused on international flows, and bear in mind, in fact, most of the personal data appears to be processed in the EU. I think to remember that, in fact, data protection law was developed as what was perceived as a response to the dangers to privacy resulting from information technology. I think there was a recognition among the lawmakers who introduced data protection, in our case the 1988 Data Protection Act, that there were increasing challenges for privacy and for our right to privacy from information technology. And in fact, originally our laws only applied to electronic processing of data. They now apply to all data, manual as well. But I think it's as well to remember that, in fact, we owe our data protection laws, if that's the word, to a perceived threat from, if you like, the information age or the internet age. I think just a few slides here from this Eurobarometer survey in terms of, are people concerned about privacy and about data protection? You'll see from that the Irish people seem more concerned than the EU average about data protection. Interesting also, when companies were asked, did they consider that the requirements of data protection law were necessary? The EU average is 91%, Irish companies 99%. So there seems to be a certain view out there that data protection law is actually important, both for individuals and that also companies recognize that, in fact, data protection requirements, even though they're onerous in many respects, are in fact necessary and potentially good business. Coming now to the vexed issue of technology and state security. There's been a shifting balance in this area since the terrible events of 9/11 in New York. The balance has shifted very much against privacy and in the direction of security for understandable reasons. We've had laws passed, including in Ireland, obliging telecommunications companies to retain data just in case it might be useful for law enforcement purposes. We've also had very strong endorsement by the Department of Justice here and by the Gardaí of the use of CCTV in public spaces. We have increased data sharing within the government system in general. We've also all noticed increased border controls. Those of us who have gone to the States will obviously have had the joy of being fingerprinted and photographed each time we go in. And now the EU is proposing a similar mechanism for its legal system. So it has raised questions about as to are we going too far, in fact, in terms of invading people's privacy in the cause of state security. I think we all recognise the absolute need to protect individuals from terrorism and for other forms of serious crime. But there's an issue of balance here. It's very much a political issue, and the issue is, are we gone too far there? Again, there's a bill going through the Oireachtas at present, which will make it obligatory for non-IIEA nationals to carry a biometric ID card. And I think you probably raised the question, is it just a matter of time before this becomes an obligation for all of us? More broadly within the EU data law enforcement area, there is now a thing called the principle of availability, which means basically if there's data available in one country which could be of use to law enforcement in another member state, then it should be available to them. Now, there is a corresponding, or supposed to be corresponding, a data protection decision, but that is relatively weak compared to the Data Protection Directive.